Good evening. My name is Peter Christian Wagner. I am the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. This is your first time with us. I invite you to learn more about the Gotham Center online at gothamcenter.org, where you can find hundreds of podcasts, recorded interviews, panel discussions, original essays, book reviews, and more on all things New York City history. Those of you looking for a deeper dive may also be interested in our new online education program. You can learn more about that at gothamed.com. With that said, tonight, as part of our regular public event series featuring the best and most interesting new scholarship on New York City history, we'll be discussing this great new book just released by Cornell University Press, written by historian David N. Gellman, entitled Liberty's Chain: Slavery, Abolition, and the Jay Family of New York. Although John Jay is not the only person in this book, he is probably the most familiar to you all. Obviously one of the most influential members of the revolutionary generation, president of the Continental Congress during the American Revolution, with John Adams and Ben Franklin, played a crucial role in negotiating an end to the War for Independence. With George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, was the moving force behind the convention that replaced the Articles of Confederation with the US Constitution. Was the inaugural Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the author of the treaty that avoided a potentially disastrous war with England under President Adams, author of the New York's first Constitution, elected its governor, and signed the bill putting slavery in New York, the North's largest state, on the road to abolition. Like nearly all of the iconic founders of the US, from Washington and Jefferson to Madison and Hamilton, he was also a slave owner. Although this information still appears to upset many people, it should not be surprising. As our speaker notes, not only were most of the patriarchs in the Jay family slave owners, so were most of the merchants who formed the ruling elite of colonial New York and the early republic. That also most of the merchants and political rulers in the early modern Atlantic. Slavery had formed the economic basis of the West African empires for 1,000 years, in fact. But with the rise of market agriculture and early manufacturing in the 1600s and 1700s, slavery became a far, far larger business than it had been during the Middle Ages. Enslaved labor doing much of the grisly work of establishing the global commercial empires of modern Western Europe and the early United States. Still, the founders continued to perplex many because many of them were also opposed to slavery. Jay himself served as the founding president of the New York Manumission Society, one of the world's first anti-slavery organizations, established in 1785. That hypocrisy, a standard for politicians, continues to disturb many Americans who have long been taught to regard the stars of the American Revolution as anything but politicians, lowly politicians. I don't expect any of the Gotham Center's followers to be unfamiliar with the ongoing controversies surrounding Washington and Jefferson, or the more recent discoveries like the fact of Hamilton's slaveholding, but Jay has yet to appear in court. Other scholars and institutions have, of course, addressed Jay's connections to slavery, but our speaker tonight has gone far beyond those relatively few examples and well beyond Jay himself, providing us with a multi-generational study of a family whose name became synonymous with abolition in the decades leading up to the Civil War. His achievement should be emphasized up front because, as I hope we'll get a chance to discuss later, it stands on a documentary record that is, quote, stunningly thin. Gellman's family biography also functions very well as a history of the early conflict over slavery itself, beginning with the push for gradual emancipation in the critical period and following the westward expansion of slavery and the evolution of anti-slavery from the colonization schemes of the early 1800s and moral suasion of the William Lloyd Garrison years to calls for immediate abolition and even racial equality in the decades before the slave question broke the nation in two, as well as the tragic descent of Southern Reconstruction into Jim Crow. John Jay was obviously the most famous of the clan, but Gellman's study will no doubt reintroduce many to descendants of the patriarch who served as prize activists because of their family's legacy with the founding. And though he emphasized that this is not quite a Whiggishly progressive story of sons building on the accomplishment of fathers and grandfathers, he writes, quote, "At many crucial moments in the tumultuous 19th century, the Jays chose the path of greater rather than lesser resistance to slavery's pervasive power." So with that much said, I will leave it to our speaker to elaborate, but allow me first to introduce him so we can get to the conversation we're all eagerly awaiting. David Gellman is a professor of history at DePaul University in Indiana, where he teaches courses in U.S. history from the age of the Revolution through the Civil War. He is the co-author of American Odysseys, a history of colonial North America, published by Oxford University Press, as well as the co-author of Jim Crow, New York, a documentary history of race and citizenship, 1777 to 1877, published by New York University Press. His first book, Emancipating New York, The Politics of Slavery and Freedom, provided what is still perhaps the most complete study to date of the abolition of slavery in New York State. And he is the author of numerous fellowships and several prizes as well, which in the interest of time, I won't mention here. For you fans of the boss out there, he's also published several essays on Bruce Springsteen, about whom he teaches a course at DePaul. So I'm very happy to welcome him here to the Gotham Center. And it's my distinct pleasure as well to introduce our discussant who'll be joining us soon, David Wallstreicher, a professor of history at CUNY's Graduate Center and one of the leading historians of the early republic in 19th century America. He is the author of Slavery's Constitution, From Revolution to Ratification, Runaway America, Benjamin Franklin, Slavery and the American Revolution, and In the Midst of Perpetual Fetes, The Making of American Nationalism. As editor, his book includes Revolutions and Reconstructions, Black Politics in the Long 19th Century, The Diaries of John Quincy Adams, Beyond the Founders, and more. His scholarly articles and books have similarly won prizes from many of the leading prestigious academic professional associations, and he has just finished, I'm happy to announce, writing a biography we've all been long awaiting, The Odyssey of Phyllis Wheatley, which will be published with Farrar, Straus, and Garreau. So I'm very pleased to welcome him back to the Gotham Center too. I'm going to turn things now over to David Gellman, who will provide a brief overview of his book before David Wallstreicher joins us in conversation. But first, the usual little bit of housekeeping. As always, discussion will last until about 7:30 or so, at which point we will take your questions. We disabled the chat function out of respect to our speakers, but I encourage you to send in questions at any time during the conversation. The Q&A icon is at the bottom of your screen. So with that, please join me in welcoming our esteemed speakers with a bit of silent applause.
Okay. Get the screen up. Oops. Thank you, Peter, for that very warm introduction. And thank you to David Wallstreicher, or David W., for our purposes tonight, for taking the time out of his busy schedule to be my interlocutor. And most of all, thank you to the audience for being here in the midst of this season of celebration. Let's start in the middle. William Lloyd Garrison proclaimed on June 23rd, 1833, quote, "The taunting appellation of fanatics and madmen has no longer power to injure us." This has got to be among the most wildly inaccurate predictions the famed editor of The Liberator, the flagship newspaper of radical abolitionism, ever made. What prompted this statement? William J. To quote Garrison again, "This highly distinguished gentleman, the worthy son of the illustrious John Jay, has avowed himself a decided abolitionist." This Garrison statement was much closer to the truth. The revered founding father, John Jay's younger son, a 44-year-old conservative judge in Westchester County, had published a letter in the New York abolitionist newspaper, The Emancipator, which Garrison's newspaper eagerly reprinted. In that letter, William J. endorsed the principle of, quote, moral interference with slavery by, quote, exhorting slaveholders to liberate their slaves. Having Judge Jay endorse the new abolitionist movement's core principle of moral suasion as a means of immediately ending slavery was indeed news. John Jay's son and admiring biographer, William J., seemed to be providing the radical movement against slavery with historical and establishment credibility. The charges of abolitionist fanaticism and even of mental derangement, however, would not cease. Indeed, when in 1835, William J. published his next book, A Firm Embrace of the American Anti-Slavery Society, the Garrisonian interracial organization spearheading the radical abolitionist cause, detractors were withering in their criticism. William J. had inexplicably thrown himself in with the, quote, zealots, who peddled, quote, dangerous theories. A harsh critic of William J.'s 1835 call for an immediate end to slavery asks, quote, Under what other influence, save that of pure fanaticism, could an intelligent, virtuous, and respectable citizen gravely affix his name to a book containing such perversions of facts? The organization Jay embraced, the American Anti-Slavery Society, was labeled, quote, anti-American in its very nature. William Jay, however, charged forward. From his stately home in Bedford, New York, he spent the rest of his life publishing increasingly radical indictments of Southern slavery, Northern racism, and a country in moral and mortal peril for its sins. He embraced the cause most likely to tear apart the nation, whose founding was the source of his family's name and grand historical reputation. It was the same house where the elderly John Jay, first Chief Justice of the United States, President of the Continental Congress, negotiator of two famous treaties with Great Britain, and two-term governor of New York, lived out his nearly 3 decades of retirement from public life. It was the same house where in the 1830s, Clorinda and Zilpah, the last 2 people held as slaves by John Jay, still served, though now as free people. The law and order judge William Jay, forced from the bench in the 1840s, likely as a political sop to pro-slavery Democrats, would support the work of the Underground Railroad from this house as well. Peers, as well as antagonists, were perplexed by a man who could have more quietly enjoyed the privileges of his wealth, status, and inherited fame. After his death in 1858, some remembrances by friends and colleagues danced around the subject of William Jay's abolitionism, which they found embarrassing. Not so Frederick Douglass. The great African-American writer and orator proclaimed of William Jay, in the great cause of universal freedom, his name was a tower of strength and his pen a two-edged sword. Douglass, in a eulogy delivered at an African-American church in Manhattan, identified William's moral and historical peers as great British abolitionists like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson, rather than the slavery-compromised American founders. Douglass drew particular attention to an incendiary clause that Jay had included in his will, a $1,000 donation entrusted to his son, the abolitionist attorney John Jay II, to support his work on behalf of people accused of being fugitive slaves. Douglass made no mention of another clause in Jay's will, granting an annuity to Zilpah and instructions that when Zilpah passed away, she'd be buried in William's own churchyard plot. In 1872, Zilpah Montgomery, born as the human property of John Jay in the 1790s, finally passed. John Jay II honored his father's wishes, and there is her gravestone. This introduction gives you some sense of the scope of the project, thematically and chronologically, as well as the moral ambiguity that I attempt to encompass. The narrative spans roughly from 1685, when John Jay's grandfather Auguste emigrated from France to North America, to 1912, when John Jay's great-great-grandson, John J. Chapman, bore witness to a horrifying act of white supremacist violence. I embarked upon this project many years ago with sweeping goals and no idea how long it would take to achieve them. I wanted to find a new way to write about the founders in slavery, and in the comparatively understudied John Jay, found an ideal figure in a field of inquiry dominated by Thomas Jefferson and the South. I wanted to tell a family story, one in which African Americans as well as Euro Americans would feature prominently. All of us, in one way or another, are defined by family, by the presence and absence of family members in our lives, by arrivals and departures, by ancestors, future generations, and memories. I wanted to examine the transfer and transformation of values across a wide arc of American history, with the century between the Declaration of Independence and the end of Reconstruction at its core. How do we make sense of a prominent American family that owned enslaved men and women in the 18th and into the 19th century, whose most famous member held people in slavery even as he served as the inaugural president of the New York Manumission Society, one of the world's first anti-slavery organizations, and still owned slaves as governor when his state passed a gradual emancipation law, whose eldest son and nephew also served as presidents of the New York Manumission Society, and his younger son, William, who you've just met, and grandson, John Jay II, became fierce, controversial activists for emancipation and against racism. And then how do we make sense of all the freedom work that went undone or was undone in the wake of an emancipating Civil War? Woven into this historical landscape are stories of enslaved and formerly enslaved members of various Jay households. Benton Brash, accused of participating in a plot to burn Manhattan to the ground in 1741. Caesar, whose recalcitrance tested the patience of the anti-slavery governor, but who later returned to the J fold. Of Abby, who died tragically in France in the aftermath of the Peace of Paris, where John Jay negotiated US independence. Of Pete, brought to London in 1794 to serve the Chief Justice as he negotiated another treaty with implications for the politics of slavery. And of course, Clorinda and Zilpa, a mother and daughter, both born as Jay family slaves who lived for many years as servants after receiving their freedom. The experience of these women and men matter in their own right. Their stories also tell us much about the nature of the political and moral journeys of the Jays, who so dramatically contributed to the building, tearing apart, and the rebuilding of the nation. Taken together, I think these stories help us to think anew about what we mean by such charged words as conservatism, radicalism, and patriotism. Taken together, I hope these stories will help us think more deeply about the vitality and the elusiveness of the concept of liberty. And with that, I will turn off my PowerPoint and turn myself over to David Wallstreicher's queries and then the audience's questions.
Thank you, David, for that, the sweep of that, which gives us such a vivid sense of just how ambitious this book is, how many years it covers, how many people are important parts of the story, and how special and unusual the Jay family was. I think a logical place for us to start is, at the risk of a little negativity, if the Jays are so important, if the Jays were so well known in the 19th century that Frederick Douglass, who we now know was the most famous African American of the 19th century, felt compelled to give this eulogy of William Jay, why aren't they better known? Why don't we know more about William Jay, even at a time when we're searching for redemptive stories about anti-slavery, and the abolitionists are getting a much becoming central to our stories about the past?
That's a great question. So some of it is the sort of mechanics of history. So John Jay, of the leading founders, is easily the least covered in biographies. Finally showed up as one of four on Joe Ellis's The Quartet, but somehow gets left out. And so I think, as famous as John Jay is, he is sort of of that group of 7, 8 founders, the one who gets the least coverage. And part of that is the happenstance of history and historical recovery. The Jay family stayed together, was very the various branches, lots of children on all the branches, and they remained in the family home into the 1950s, which meant that the papers were largely in private hands well into the 20th century. Didn't make it into a lot of the sort of repositories, and never got that sort of, if you go to any college or university library, even someone like Alexander Hamilton, who died young, has a set of complete works that is longer than I can contain in this Zoom frame, let alone someone like Benjamin Franklin, where Yale University Press is still coming out with papers. And so John Jay, partly for just reasons of happenstance, never got that treatment, and therefore was a little less accessible than some of the other founders. As to then why his abolitionist descendants, William Jay and John Jay II, who were very prominent, often controversial, and really their name, their work was important, and their name magnified that work, because everybody knew that William Jay was the first biographer of his father, and wrote a loving biography. Everyone knew, obviously, that John Jay II was literally the namesake of John Jay. And part of the reason Frederick Douglass, talks about the name is because it was powerful, although alas not magical, in giving the lie to the notion that somehow the abolitionists were by definition betraying the founders and the founding. Although their critics would hurl that insult, and it was like fingers on a chalkboard to the Jays when they would say, how can these radicals, they're betraying the wonderful moderate position of the great patriarch. And so that's a lot of the dynamic I talk about in the book, but it also goes to your point that at the time, their fame derived not only from their actions, but the fact that they were Jays, and they were very aware of this, and they used this to their advantage. As to why that part of the abolitionist story, the Jay part of the abolitionist story, hasn't been more prominent. I mean, it's really interesting to me that getting into the weeds, that John Jay II, almost from the moment William Jay died, knew that he should write a biography. But he never did. And then he ended up, and you can find notes for the biography. I mean, this would have, he would have been the one, even as the abolitionists were falling out of fashion. It's harder and harder to get abolitionist biographies published by mainstream presses in the 1890s and going forward. But he never completed the project. And in some ways, to get to the very end of the book, was more comfortable now that the nation was reunited and slavery had been emancipated, sort of embracing the nationalist part of the family name, because he was ambitious to rehabilitate the family name. And with the emancipation of slavery, suddenly that tension between the founding and slavery that are sort of pulling in different directions, with the Civil War for John Jay II, they snap back together. And he becomes the kind of person you have on big anniversary dates to give a speech about the Battle of Harlem Plains or the sesquicentennial of Columbia University. And he would have been the one to really tell his father's story the way it needed to be told, and didn't, and having to commission a biography at the end of his life that was okay and got reviewed in the New York Times and the Nation. But at that point, the country was busily reuniting and forgetting. The sort of forgetting and reuniting industry was, as you know, very strong. And so the story of their remarkable achievement did not get featured in most 20th centuries, even of abolitionism, despite the fact that their peers thought of them as among the stars in the firmament of abolitionism.
Something I learned that I hadn't known, and at the risk of staying in the weeds, is that John Jay II was one of the first presidents of the American Historical Association.
Yes.
At a time, and but at that time, he's saying things like, "We need to save our great Western nation because it's the savior of the world, and we can't let these immigrants take over our culture." And he's hanging out with Josiah Strong. So this isn't exactly it's really it's wonderful how that kind of hit me between the eyes. Really, I wasn't expecting that. I was all ready to have a different view of how they kept the flame alive. Of not going with the flow, not going with the conventional wisdom, but that's not doesn't seem to be what's going on in the 1880s and 90s. How would you explain that or account for it?
Well, it's so interesting, and here we are at the end of the book, so we've saved everybody a lot of time. I think one thing that is clear to me is he knew that the most important thing he did in his life was the abolitionist cause, because he said so. I mean, in private letters, and he knew that although obviously he lived a very elite and wealthy life, I mean, he was blackballed by a lot of New York elites in the 1850s because he was doing things that elite white New York lawyers weren't supposed to do, like representing fugitives and going into court and using people like Louis Napoleon, Sarah Groningseder has written about so well, as an informant and as a collaborator in trying to save fugitive slaves. And people thought not only was this a betrayal of their notion of a very, very conservative founding, but it's also was sort of socially uncouth, right? And threatening in New York to destroy the nation. And New York is a port that is very much involved in processing both literally and through insurance and banking the wealth of the South. And so he understood that was the greatest thing he ever did in his life, the most bold. And I think, and he never repudiated that, but he threw a lot of that moral fervor and even that sort of paranoia and edginess that I think you probably picked up on in his personality into an extreme nativism and virulent anti-Catholicism that is sort of a streak in the Jay family story, going back to the fact that they were Huguenots who fled France when the Edict of Nantes was revoked. I mean, that's how the Jays got here. And so there's immigrants who are coming in, and the corruption of abuse of civil service and the danger that the American story, as you say, won't be properly taught to this, this unwashed hordes of European immigrants. A lot of the moral fervor that had animated him in his younger life went into these causes that we look at with justifiably with good bit of horror. And it's not that he ignored or was unaware that there was an ongoing Southern problem, but I think he liked being a player. When he was the head of the group investigating the Custom House corruption, and he was on the Civil Service Commission, and he was writing all these screeds, and as you say, hiring Josiah Strong, one of the most infamous, famous nativists of the entire 19th century. And so, yeah, his moral energies were diverted, and that sort of prestige of not being an outsider, I think, and becoming an insider, definitely, took his eye off of the cause that made him great and that he knew had made him great.
If he wanted to be a player and ended up at the end of his life with the conservative elites that he his family had been part of for generations, how do we account for that radicalism of William and John Jay Jr.?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, and that's one of the things that's so interesting to me is that, like, if you were to take the range of their opinions, even in their radical, pre-Civil War and Civil War phase, and like I say, John Jay II was writing about the importance to put African Americans in the Union Army well before Lincoln did so, and like he understood the nature of the conflict and the potential of the conflict. So even but if you were to take the array of their social opinions, they are conservatives, right? They are a member of a privileged elite. They have tremendous inherited wealth in the lands that, because the Jays are married into all the famous patroon families in one way or another, the lands and rents in New York City and in the Hudson Valley, right? I mean, they in some ways embody that sort of privilege of old New York. But this issue of slavery to them is a moral issue that is threatening to destroy anything that was good and meaningful about the founding. And so William Jay, even before, in his biography of John Jay towards the end, makes this statement that he comes back to when talking about John Quincy Adams, which is that John Jay never accept the notion my country right or wrong. That for them, the legacy of John Jay was as much a moral one as a political one. Now, of course, when you read the book and you read about John Jay, the sort of moral high ground that they attribute to his character gets pretty complicated and dicey when you see how he deals with slavery and slaves. But they saw him as a moral beacon, and they believed, and again, one of the things about writing history from letters is that things you can't write about are the conversations at the dinner table. William Jay lived with John Jay in the John Jay homestead as an adult for many years, and insisted that he had imbibed, to use William Jay's own words, he had imbibed his anti-slavery from his father. And they believed that his father's heart was in emancipation and abolitionism, and that he recognized that moral principle. And so they saw themselves, so they thought people who indicted them for being too radical, they always felt like they're splitting hairs. It's not about the means, it's the end. So John Jay was for gradual emancipation because I'm looking at it from their perspective. That was the program on offer, That was how it was being done, and he saw it through both in his professional and his personal life. But they would say to their critics, don't get caught up in the means, focus on the ends. And we live not in post-revolutionary America, we live in this time when slavery is spreading like wildfire across the South, and we are talking about now millions of people, and a country that is not ambivalent in its policies towards slavery, but embracing, in all its moral fecklessness, pro-slavery policies, not just when the Constitution demands it, but everywhere else in politics. And to them, that was the issue. And they're not either big D or small d Democrats, right? They have their confidence that public opinion in the end will turn towards the right and the good is not something that they believed or believed fully. I mean, they're very ambivalent about democracy, the small d. So in some ways, their embrace of abolitionism is an outlier in their sort of political and social universe. But it was the most important. But the thing is that was more important to them than all the other stuff in the politics of their day.
Right. There was an earlier historiography or an earlier memory of the 19th century that would never be surprised that people who were seriously anti-slavery were more likely to have doubts about democracy. Right. We think democracy and anti-slavery were or should have been the same thing, but you make very clear that for the Jays, being conservative enough to have doubts about democracy helped them keep an anti-slavery backbone.
Well, and so one of the pivot points to just illustrate this more concretely. So the race riots in 1834, which John Jay II was a student at Columbia and was actually protecting abolitionist property, and his father's up there in Bedford and Westchester County. I mean, this was a horrifying and sort of telling moment for them. Like, this is what the other side is like, right? They're violent, right? They will destroy property. They will attack American citizens. However, even if African Americans were treated like second-class citizens, but they never doubted that they were Americans, right? They never went for the notion of colonization. They never imagined that the appropriate place for free Black people was anywhere other than the land that they were born in the United States. And they were, as sort of witnesses, John Jay II up close and William Jay from several miles up in Westchester County. I mean, to them, this is the proof that a sort of slaveholders' democracy, even though there's no more legal slavery in New York, a slaveholders' democracy is a morally compromised and ugly and violent thing. And so that was a real turning point in their abolitionism, that Garrison kind of jumped the gun in 1833. One letter did not make William Jay suddenly all in, but the riots in 1834, after that, there was no turning back for him. And he became, we can use, and this is one of the things, words like conservatism and liberal, conservative and liberal that we use now, they mean different things, but on race, one of the things that's interesting is William Jay keeps moving towards a more and more egalitarian stance. And in some ways, his son, as often happens, is sort of helping to pull him along in that direction. So that when he joins the American Anti-Slavery Society, he's a little skittish about whether an interracial sort of governing structure might be a turnoff to other people. He gets over it and joins. But John Jay II and then William Jay sort of goes along with him, have become increasingly critical, not just of Southern slavery, but of Northern racism, and try to integrate institutions like the Episcopal Church in a way that made them very unpopular with their elite peers.
Right, and it's that Episcopalian story is fascinating, and a reminder that sometimes sometimes well-meaning historians who, for example, putting evangelical Protestants at the center of the story of abolitionism, that may be really an important dynamic, and it may be true for numbers, but that can lead you to miss this important parallel story that's going on that involves a lot of people. If you're Episcopalian anywhere near New York, and maybe in the whole country, you know damn well who the Jays are, and it really matters that they're stirring the pot of discord in the church, right?
Yes, right, and creating all kinds of enmity and aggravation. I mean,
they go after the underdogs. He goes
yes.
after the bishop, the twin bishops in New York and Philadelphia,
and brings them down in a very contemporary story, right? They get underdog not on his racism, but on his womanizing, right? I mean, that's what they get him on, and you don't want to be an enemy of the Jays because they, they know how to tell their story, and so they get him.
And literally, one of the things that fascinated me about was that they're prolific. They are people. So in the older literature on abolitionism, it always seemed like it was about, oh, he wrote another tract, but nobody read it, right? But now here it's like he writes a book, and it goes through 5 editions, and people are talking about it in newspapers. And William Jay is an extremely effective, and he's a judge. He's not just a polemicist. People take what he has to say very seriously, and he's if anything scholarly yet accessible in his approach. And I had started to notice that he's starting to show up in footnotes of scholars who are emphasizing less not so much. It's not that moral suasion is not being emphasized in the abolition scholarship, or doesn't need to be emphasized, but there's more and more emphasis on constitutionalism and congressional debates and anti-slavery as politics, as opposed to as religion or as a separate social movement that constitutes it in opposition to the political system. And with that, you're seeing just how important these moments when he writes a whole book about how the Mexican War is pro-slavery and is going to sink the old republic. That's huge. That's huge. That it's not an accident that he's in dialogue with John Quincy Adams and that they're friends and they're engaged and admire each other. And as you see in the diary, that he's really a parallel figure to John Quincy Adams, son of the founder, right?
Yeah,
and so what he has to say matters, and he's saying it well, maybe better than anybody else can, not just because of who he is, but because he actually knows the history and has the time and leisure to go to the library to back it up.
Yeah, I mean, William Jay is as responsible as anyone for getting John Quincy Adams involved in the Amistad case, and William Jay is feeding him research that then shows up in John Quincy Adams' congressional statements and stuff. So yeah, I mean, he's got more pull with a son of a founding father than the Tappins, right? I mean, he's legit in that way, and William Jay just so admired John Quincy Adams' iconoclasm in the late stages of his life, that he sort of in some ways gives the same compliments to John Quincy Adams as he had to his father, in the sense that your country doesn't embody morality, morality embodies morality. And that's, and that sort of spirit he kind of takes from his father and applies to John Quincy Adams on John Quincy Adams. Which is kind of a neat trick.
Which is why it's so important for the movement to have figures like that who can embody the argument that anti-slavery is in the tradition of the revolution. So if it's so if it's so obvious to us now that and William Jay is very clear, and everyone knows that John Jay was anti-slavery, how is it that so many people were able to say that William Jay wasn't being faithful to his father's legacy and was kind of a traitor?
Well, for a couple of reasons. One, because John Jay is a gradualist, and if to the degree that he has a major anti-slavery accomplishment on his resume, it's seeing that being governor. How much he actually had to do with the political mechanics is not clear, but being governor when New York finally initiates its program of gradual emancipation, being the inaugural president of the New York Manumission Society, and in certain circumstances, sort of standing up against slavery. But there's no way to look at John Jay's actual career as an anti-slavery person and as a politician and say that he's willing to make compromises. Certainly, the Constitution being, a central compromise. To be a Federalist and to advocate so strongly for the Constitution is to say the compromises we made on slavery were worth it for this more important goal, right, of getting, of national unity and nation building. So they're not, that's one of the things I wrestled with and that I had the characters wrestle with is it's not entirely inaccurate of William Jay's critics to say you are way out beyond where your father ever was in terms of temperament, in terms of the speed, in terms of the sort of moral judgments and criticisms of the nation. That's part of the reason why those criticisms sort of work and why they're so irritating, because there's a way of construing John Jay's career as the antithesis of the radicals. It's not the way that William Jay and John Jay II choose to think of the story, but they do have to make some sort of there's some mental gymnastics involved in seeing themselves as a straightforward, carrying forward the tradition of John Jay, because the tradition of John Jay is compromise and gradualism. And he was a slaveholder, and he did free people on a schedule that he set. He did free them, but on a schedule that he set. He's not an immediatist, and there's no way to argue that he was. And so that's something that hits hard because it's not on its face a slander or untrue.
Let's talk some more about some of those enslaved people. And the first time I got an inkling of that David was working on this book was when I read his fabulous essay on the Jays in France and Abbé. Is it Abbey or Abbé?
Yeah, Abbey.
I think they Abbey. I think they spelled it with an E. Sometimes it looks
yes.
We're in France, so it's tempting to say Abbé. But and the tragic story of her running away and her death after she was in jail for a few weeks. And I knew about that story because I had noticed, because Franklin plays a role, and I had written about Franklin and slavery. And they actually asked Franklin to intervene, and he suggests that they let her stew in the tombs, as it were, for a while, and that ends up being a decisive thing that leads to her death. So I know that from the beginning of your, maybe even more so than the story about gradualism and the long scope of the Jay family, you had it in mind that the story about the Jays enslaved people was not only going to be a part of the story, but it was one of your motivations for trying to tell the whole long story and figure it out. What do you feel you were able to learn and to show about their lives, about their role in the story of slavery and anti-slavery? What are you, and looking back, how successful do you think you were in integrating this sort of holy grail for those of us who work on founding fathers and slavery, integrating those stories of not just the founding fathers and slavery, but founding fathers and slavery and enslaved people?
Well, and I hope this, I want to answer that question in two ways. One of my fondest hopes for this book is that people will be dissatisfied enough to keep going and get even better at telling those stories and get even better at contextualizing the stories of all the enslaved people whose lives I try to incorporate. We have generations of Jefferson biographies to create a sort of floor, a base upon which to build all this great history that's being done about African Americans at Monticello, not just Sally Hemings, but all from other people. And so I don't mean this was false modesty, to the degree that their stories are not fully realized. I hope that that people will pick up the book and say that Gellman needed to do better here, and I'm going to be the one to figure out where in the Westchester County, court records I can get at some of these things. But that's not said as an excuse. That's a legitimate hope. And one of the things I love about being a scholar is that you're opening up conversations, not closing them down. That said, their lives are incredibly important in and of themselves, but they're also important because they expose how that the limitations, particularly for John Jay, of what he means by, he writes his friend in 1780 that our prayers for liberty will be impious until we start abolishing slavery. He's writing that as he brings not only Abby, who was in the William Livingston's family, his father-in-law's family, but he purchases a 15-year-old in Martinique named Benoit and brings him to France. And this, by the way, is arguably or more than likely a violation of French law to be holding enslaved people in Paris. The French tried to have a cordon. They didn't want West Indian planters to bring slave properties beyond the port. So, it does expose hypocrisy. It also exposes the ways in which sometimes anti-slavery can be an abstraction, even when, or maybe because you have enslaved people in your presence, so that John Jay lives and knows Abby, but is befuddled. He can't figure out why she's so mad and why she would run away and do wage work, a couple of blocks away rather than stay with his wife, Sally. But part of the reason she ran away was because she sort of found that even in their own home, she was being kind of subordinated to a French servant who was being mean to her. And John Jay said, I promised her that when I brought her back to America that I was going to free her. Well, we have no idea whether he did or not, but even if he did, what is that promise worth? And yet he has trouble comprehending. And that's kind of interesting, the ways in which people can live in the same household, cheek by jowl. I think the African Americans in the households had incentive to understand their white owners and masters and mistresses more than the masters and mistresses were willing to delve into the psychology of the people who helped to ensure their comfort and connect them to home. And Sally J has 2 children and a miscarriage over in Europe, and who's there with her but Abby, who's been a servant in her family, right? And so the callousness that can accompany higher ideals is important to see. I think another thing that really comes through for the subsequent generations, particularly William J. and Peter Augustus J., the older son, is on a more positive note, is they just don't imagine that African Americans have no place in America, in the United States. And I mentioned that earlier, that the idea that Black people don't belong, especially if they're free, and maybe this is because in their elite mindset, they have a place, and it might be more servants and more humble people, but they're not alien, right? They never imagine African Americans as alien to American shores. And I think some of that has to do with their personal experience, that they've always lived, or African Americans have always been a presence in J family lives. So I think that's really important. And, we learned something about John Jay actually believing in gradual emancipation by the fact that he applies to Zilpa a formula that actually doesn't apply to her. In other words, he frees her on a date, and I think he actually didn't know when she was born, but he says, okay, you've reached the age at which females, by the formula of gradual emancipation, even though that formula doesn't legally apply to you, that's the formula I'm going to use, which suggests to me that he actually believed in gradualism, not just politically, but that it was a sensible way to wind this horrible institution down, which for modern ears, for 21st century ears, sounds very strange, but that is in fact how he did it and how New York did it, and he sort of believed that this was a viable way of eliminating slavery. And the last thing I was going to say, was, and I'm not calling out other scholars, but the idea, there's a book about New England and slavery that talks about amnesia, that New England abolitionists were able to become abolitionists because they effaced or erased or even flat out forgot that there is a tradition of enslavement in New England. And that's an argument that scholars have made. And one of the things that very early in my research occurred to me is that's not an option for the Jays. There is no amnesia option, right? These are people in their homes. Again, 1872 is a very important date. That's the middle of Reconstruction when the last formerly enslaved person in the Jay family dies. So that notion that to be a Northern abolitionist is to forget Northern slavery or white Northern responsibility or for slavery is not a thing that the Jays could or did think. They can't forget slavery. They're reminded of it literally every day.
Though I think the way you so effectively show how John and Sarah Livingston Jay how their paternalism constantly forgets that they're exercising power and that there's violence at the heart of this kind of suggests that paternalism is a kind of daily amnesia of that where you're constantly making yourself forget that these people who you're saying are part of your family are really not part of your family, and you're not treating them as part of your family except in the ways that make you feel better about
yes, and that you get to choose when you are caring, because that sometimes they are. Sometimes they're incredibly callous, but sometimes they're incredibly caring. And John Jay instructs his son, Peter Augustus Jay, that you owe some of these enslaved people certain courtesies, like, bring this letter from I'm going to forget exactly which two people are involved, but, you have a responsibility. And he instructs Peter J. Monroe, you have the elderly, formerly enslaved people who no longer work and live, very hand to mouth. We have a responsibility to help fund them in their, dying years. And they instruct each other across generations. But it, of course, it involves forgetting. It involves, it is noblesse oblige. It is paternalism. But it is also a structure of thought. That's one of the inheritances, is that you have some responsibility. But the bad side of that is, except when you don't, right? You have responsibility when you choose to exercise responsibility. But if someone crosses you or is difficult, or if you never agreed, like the story of Dinah, who briefly is in the Jay household in Albany, and has a child that John Jay's like, can we find a place to put her child? Because obviously he wants her to do work, and having a 2-year-old in the household isn't going to help. And then eventually Dinah leaves the Jay household, and years later comes back and said, we were supposed to get, me and my child were supposed to be manumitted, but my child is still being treated as a slave, and you kind of need to intervene. And John Jay writes to Peter Augustus Jay and says, I have no memory that I ever made a promise or wrote a document to that effect. So you get to also dismiss when you decide you don't owe someone something. And that's, as you say, the violence and the power and the inequality that's at the heart of the institution, north or south.
Right, and you're able to bring out of the longer family story actually helps you bring out how difficult it is for the Africans and their descendants to keep families together, given that all the flexibility is on the side of the masters. Even when the masters think, oh, we're not selling them, we're keeping them in the family, but the way they keep them in the family actually redistributes them every 10 or 20 years, and so that they're separated from their children and their parents. And so,
yes, and it's a very isolating life, and more so with time, because speaking of class and religion and stuff, over the course of the 19th century, not just in the Jay family, but throughout the elite North, Irish Catholic servants, supplant African-American servants as the sort of who's serving in these households. And so imagine how Zilpa's life as a servant in the family changed from having been around other African-Americans, including her mother, to later in her life, where, you can see on the census, there's 5 or 6 women from Ireland, and her as she's increasing in age. And so it's very isolating, even when it's a freedom story.
Earlier on, you rightly emphasized the the anti-racism and the opposition to colonization ideology that the Jays had, and William Jay especially. How did the various Jays' thoughts on race and racism change over time? Are they consistent? What and how would you relate that to the larger story about how we're thinking, especially how we're thinking about race now as a consensus ideology deep in our past, or rather as something that has more of a race and racism having a history, waxing and waning, being politicized, depoliticized, changing significantly over time?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I would say is, right, it's contested between people and over time. I think that Paul Polgar, who I know you know well, is right that that first movement, gradual emancipationist talk, is very much of African Americans becoming citizens. That citizenship is the logical next step that grows out of emancipation. And I think that John Jay believed that, because I quote him several times as saying that. And Peter Augustus Jay goes to the mat on fighting disenfranchisement in New York in the 1821 Constitution, and just says, that we've learned to understand that African Americans are going to school, they're becoming citizens, they're forming organizations, and he says, utterly incorrectly, that prejudice is dissipating, and so why would you take the vote away from people who are just coming into their own in New York as citizens? And John Jay writes a very short, but I think revealing letter about reading Peter Augustus Jay's speech, criticizing the notion of stripping blacks of the vote, and he says, that speech speaks well of you. At John Jay's last major political act, although he lived several years beyond this, is in the Missouri crisis, where he quotes that all men are created equal, part of the Declaration of Independence. Ironically, as Jefferson is freaking out that Northern sons are risking destroying the nation with their radical ideas, Jay's quoting Jefferson, a much younger Jefferson, on the notion of equality. And I think, some would argue, and they're probably not wrong, that in some way, if you have a sense of how class works, and you're comfortable with a hierarchical class structure, then sometimes race is less of a problem. I mean, you could make that argument for the Jays that African Americans will be free, and then they'll fit into a class structure that is unequal and made to be as such, and so it's not going to threaten them. But I think that's a very cynical view, because you keep seeing that forward momentum. So William Jay, being a conservative, when he first kind of throws in with abolitionism, he's like, voting's really not that important, right? Voting is something, so everyone doesn't have to vote. So let's not make that, central to this. But by the end of the 1830s, and in that wonderful pamphlet that he writes on the condition of people of color, he goes after Ohio and other northern states for all the ways in which they've denied African Americans education, access to the ballot, participations in juries. Around the same time, they are all in for getting Alexander Krummel, who goes on to be one of the most important Pan-African thinkers of the 19th century, someone celebrated by W.E.B. Du Bois. The Jays are determined that this African American person has a right to a seminary education, and has a right to take his place, and that African American congregations have a right, not just that it's a good idea, but have a right to be, as any other congregation, and equal as in participating in church governance. So over time, this sort of basic egalitarian premise, and the fact that African Americans belong here as Americans, it gives momentum and energy, gives root to more overt and more clear claims that that racial equality is part and parcel of the fight against slavery.
I have so many more questions that we didn't get to, but there's one that and we have some from the audience, but there's one I want to end with, just because it's something I like to ask. I just like to ask anyone who's finished a book. What surprised you the most? What did you learn that you weren't expecting, that came while you were researching and writing?
One of the things that I took, even though it ended up being framed as one of the central claims of the book, but occurred to me very late and at the very desk that I'm sitting at, was that John Jay II as a son, and if we think about this happens all the time in our lives, push the father. He's not just inheriting this in some sort of simple relay race. It's not just inheriting and moving forward an abolitionist tradition, but he's out ahead of his father. And in some ways, I think pulls William J. along to see how important this cause is. And that, like we see all the time where, kids come home from college with all these radical ideas and they don't sell their parents on all of them, but they do sell them on some of them. And I felt like, how did it take me? I've been working on this project for years, and it never occurred to me that John Jay II is an engine, not just an inheritor. And also to think about a multi-generational study as the fact that these people are running along, white and black are running alongside each other. They're not, it's not just the simple, and this begat that, that the generations are literally, they kind of are rubbing up against each other and are influencing each other in ways that sort of conventionally, it's like, I'm going to do this person, and then I'm going to do that person, and then I'm going to do the next person. And then at some point I'm going to say, we've taken this story to the end. And it's just the ways in which people of different generations are participants in each other's lives. That was kind of a realization that I think in some ways I had just, I had it at a time when I could actually do something with it, but it's not something that I think I understood when I started, the ways in which generations participate in each other's lives and are not neatly sort of chunked out in segments.
I relished how that lesson, which you're explicit about at several points, and helps explain what some of your characters do. There, you put out some hints that we might think better about how anti-slavery evolved and how national politics evolved, and we could imagine that that's true politically on a broader scale. That people didn't, that there aren't, oh, well, there were Jacksonian people and they had these contests, and then there were Civil War people who had these contests, that they were in, that they were referring back to each other and dealing with people who were older and younger, who were, that it was much more fluid than our usual periodizations allow. And I think that it's only by telling this multi-generational and long story that we can see that. So let's, I see that it's 7:34, so this is a good time for us to go to some questions, which I can see in the Q&A, and maybe I'll, unless Peter wants to jump in and do it because he's already read them, maybe I'll pick some out.
Well, we can take them in tandem, or you can lead off. Well, why don't I just jump in? I'm going to lead off with a comment from Rob Haberman, who's a former editor at the Gotham Center's digital publication, who was responding to something that I said at the beginning. So we're going a little out of order here, but more of a comment than a question. To the comment that I made about regarding a lack of literature on John Jay, Rob notes very correctly that the Columbia-based John Jay Papers project, of which he was an editor, recently completed its 7th volume of the selected papers of John Jay, which of course, David, you mentioned in explaining why Jay doesn't perhaps stand as tall as some of the other stars of the star founders of the revolution. Those volumes cover various aspects of Jay's life from 1760 to 1829, including his anti-slavery activities and his role as a slaveholder. And those volumes are also available online as a free and open access database on the National Archives Founders online database. So just for anyone who is curious about that, and just to make sure that no one misunderstood my comment at the beginning. Janine Valadez, apologies if I mispronounced that, gave us our first question, which is, did John Jay II draft papers in preparation for biography which never got close enough to publication? Or did he never even put content down to paper?
I mean, he has lots of notes. He definitely has notes that are kind of not, you'd have to have done a lot of work on them to turn those notes into prose. And he sort of imagined that, like, really what we need is, something more than one volume. Maybe we do, kind of what his father had done for John Jay, a biography, and then some selected papers. But he's so busy being a historian of the revolution and a sort of spokesperson for the causes that I mentioned that he just never does it. And then he realizes that he's way too old, and then they essentially hire someone to write a 1-volume biography, which was okay. But one of the things that's really unfortunate, and this may help to answer David's original question, the biography that comes out in 1894 or 1893 really turns William Jay into a much tamer, more conservative figure than he was, because by calling it William Jay and the Constitutional Movement to fight slavery, and so they sort of invent a acceptable mainstream version of abolitionism in the 1890s to fit William Jay into. But anyone who's read any of William Jay's writings, as David has, knows that he is not. He's scholarly, but the fervor and the willingness to call people out, you would never mistake him for, oh, this is just sort of a constitutional apparatus, kind of very safe abolitionism. It's not safe at all. He's constantly calling people and institutions out and questioning whether the union is worth it. And so the biography that we get of William Jay really waters down the radicalism of his commitment. And we don't know what kind of book John Jay II would have written had he written it. But I'm not convinced that people's sons are the ideal biographers of their fathers anyway. I'm not sure that we would want to build a universe around those biographies, because they're fraught. They're really fraught in ways that, inevitably so.
The Adamses didn't really manage to complete biographies per se. Luckily, but the other people started to do that work, but they did do better in getting some of the letters and writings out there in the late 19th century, and the diary, John Quincy Adams' diary too. We have a question from Robert Wong that is about Jay in France and as ambassador to Spain. Did his foreign experience shape his opinions about slavery?
Well, one of the most clear early anti-slavery expressions he has is this one that I quoted earlier about where he writes to his sort of right-hand man in New York, Egbert Benson, when he gets news that Pennsylvania in 1780 has passed a Gradual Emancipation Act, and he writes Egbert Benson and says, basically, you should tirelessly fight for one of these for New York, because until we do this, our prayers will be impious. He writes that from Europe. But before he leaves for Europe, he has some contact, I don't know if it's personal or just by letter, with Anthony Benezet. He's certainly aware of Quaker abolitionism. Benezet submits a pamphlet to him when Jay's the president of the Continental Congress, and Jay writes a very cordial, though non-committal note back. Jay, as early as 1777, said he had to leave. He did write most of the New York Constitution, but his mother was sick and he had to absent himself as they were finishing it up. And so Gouverneur Morris brings an anti-slavery plank that fails, and John Jay says it writes to Morris and to Robert Livingston and says it would have been nice if we had gotten some anti-slavery stuff in that Constitution. So some of those early thoughts are forming before he gets on the boat. But again, he buys an enslaved 15-year-old in Martinique. I mean, so he's thinking these thoughts, but he's also thinking that he would like more service in Europe.
And one of my favorite moments in the book is that you point that out, and then you also have Sarah saying that Benoit will teach her younger son French.
Yeah.
So actually, going abroad is going to help make the family cosmopolitan, and having this and it actually leads to more slavery and more uses for slave. It helps diversify the institution. So I'm going to weigh in here because this is something that comes up a lot with Franklin. Claude N. Lopez, who was a wonderful editor of the Franklin Papers, made the argument in the 70s that going abroad to France helped turn Franklin into a cosmopolitan who was then more willing to turn against slavery. Well, actually, going abroad and representing the United States in France made it convenient, if not necessary, for Franklin to act like he was anti-slavery, but also be defending America's image and interests all the time. And the way this for both Franklin and Jay, where this plays out quite in policy terms is they're the ones who have to defend the claims of the masters who have lost slaves during the war as diplomats. So if anything, it actually sends them the other way. They become point men for defending the interests of slaveholders. So despite their beliefs that in anti-slavery, it actually sends them the other direction. That's the argument I make.
And there's an older tradition where it's all John Laurens' fault, right? That when John Laurens finally shows up in Paris, he's the one who puts the pro-slavery language into the Treaty of Paris. And my research shows they were a team, they were working together. There was some good cop, bad cop, but the idea, I think it might be like Samuel Flagg Bemis or one of those diplomatic historians, just pawns it off on the South Carolinian. He must be responsible for that, but they knew what they were doing. I would say for Jay, one of the things that's interesting is that after Abby dies, shortly thereafter, he pens the manumission document for Benoit, who there's no record that he actually ever comes back to the United States, but guilty conscience, hoping this won't happen again, mixed with some sincere emerging anti-slavery. I mean, he writes this manumission document where Jay specifically says that slavery is a violation of natural law. It does not comport with natural law, and therefore I'm going to, and then, I mean, this is the part that's like, drives you crazy. It's a violation of natural law. And so when Benoit works for me a little longer and pays off the price I paid for him, he will get his freedom. So apparently you can violate natural law if you put it on a, like a time limit. But in reality, Benoit, he disappears from the record, and I think there's no reason to believe that they bring him back to the United States. But it's this weird, one step forward, one step back kind of thing that happens a lot, I think, with not just those two, but lots of founders. They have realizations, and then they have actions where they arrange things such that the realizations don't require them to inconvenience themselves too much.
We have more New York historians in the room. Kyle Bulthowitz is here, and he's asking a question about class and federalism and people like Jay. Do we see here in part the intellectual origins of social reform in general in high federalism? Is it perhaps that a marginalized political faction was necessary to help promote countercultural positions? Elizabeth Cady Stanton similarly was daughter of a Federalist politician.
I mean, as a great question and observation. Historians fight about this stuff, whether the Federalists get too much credit for being anti-slavery. I mean, I think it's, was it Sean Wilentz who said never have people done so little to get so much credit? Or I think that's actually, I think he's a little unfair in that way. I do think there is a Federalist reformist tradition. It doesn't mean that everyone who's a Federalist, it goes into social reform or anti-slavery. But I mean, certainly the Sedgwick family, which is related to the Jays by, I forget whether it's by, and their family trees touch in some way. Sedgwick family is another example of a full Federalist family that subsequent generations embrace anti-slavery. I mean, I think there is that tradition or that tendency for some of the inheritors of the declining Federalist tradition to place themselves in moral opposition to other aspects of democratic fight that they're in other ways losing. I think there's plenty of evidence for that. It doesn't mean that the Federalists were an anti-slavery party or they were in lockstep or they weren't capable of race baiting in politics. But, I mean, you think about race baiting, I mean, so we have in our conversation, right, there's a lot of things about John Jay that are troubling, but it's worth noting that when he ran for governor the first time in 1792, he was trashed for being associated with anti-slavery. He was the candidate who his opponents who were supporting Governor Clinton were putting out that if John Jay, who was the president of the Manumission Society, is elected governor, he's going to take your slaves away. And that election is so close that, who knows in a close election which thing we're going to say tipped it, but you can argue that that was a very effective strategy, sadly, as it is still an effective strategy in politics, that these egalitarians are going to take stuff away from you that's yours. They're going to take your property away. And so even though we struggle to think about, well, how much or how little credit should we give John Jay for being anti-slavery? He was vulnerable to attacks from the right, if you will, because he was anti-slavery at all.
We have a question from Lisa who asked, just how many people at the height did John Jay own? Maybe you want to build on that and sort of throw in the rest of the family.
I think, and of course, anytime I say a number and I tell my students this, I assume that I'm off by one, right? And my numbers are always wrong, but I feel like at any one time, John Jay, I feel like that 6 is the largest number I've seen. His father, Peter Jay, I think at his height certainly owned more people than that. But I think 6 is, at any one moment. But if you sort of over time, if you sort of say how many people at one time or another were slaves in John Jay's household, obviously would be a greater number than 6. But Peter Jay moves to Westchester County and is one of the, it's one of the larger slaveholders and in his part of Westchester County. As in New York, elite families owned, traded, invested in slavery. There's no two ways around that. I mean, the most clear documentation we have of Jay's grandfather and father involved in the slave trade has to do with the bringing people from the West Indies. Their names don't show up on the transatlantic slave database. That doesn't mean they weren't invested or didn't have dealings, but they definitely, that sort of intra-American slave trade in the ships that they were sending down with goods from New York were sometimes coming back with enslaved people. That much is very clear.
And that number for the late colonial period in the early republic in New York City would have been, or the New York sort of metro area, would have been roughly like that was essentially around the average for a family of their wealth, or how do they sort of stand?
I'm tempted to run across the room and get my Shane
Yeah,
White I can
a couple of days ago I would have had this number at the top of my mind, but now it's
right.
Vanished. Of
I can
course.
see the book that would have that number across the room, but I'm not going to leave the screen.
Right.
I mean, that setting up household in New York in the 1790s, even as there are more and more free people, and even as the fight against slavery is getting organized. Elite New York City families. I remember Shane White sort of demonstrating statistically are not shedding slaves; they're actually gaining enslaved people during this period because it's prestige, it's wealth, and to say something obvious, it's work, right? I mean,
yep.
The kind of households that they want to maintain require a lot of human labor.
It's a labor system. Yep.
We have a question about Rufus King and the King family, which is an obvious next topic for another intergenerational study. So get to it now. Were Rufus King and the King family political allies with the Jays?
Yes, very much so. Very much so, and in correspondence with, and that goes into the next generation too. That yes, that they, it is very much a parallel story, and they are political allies across the years, and yes, and someone needs to write that book, and I don't think it's going to be me. So no, that's a good story to tell. And they're another elite family that's hooked up in politics and education, and so they're most definitely peers.
I think our speaker has planted someone in the audience, because we have a S. Gellman who writes.
Older brother's gonna humiliate me here.
He writes, I believe it is fair to say that only in the Jay and Adams families did the next generations after the founders stay front and center in U.S. Politics or history. Was there anything in how the children of John Jay were raised that led to this outcome? I think you've gestured to that. Maybe you want to build on that.
I mean, I know, my Adams family knowledge is secondhand. My Jay family knowledge is firsthand. This is a family, they love each other. The daughters, sisters. I mean, I'm not saying that they're not without occasional controversy, but fathers in Westchester tend to depend on the sons in New York City to do family business, financial business, and book and newspaper acquisitions. But it's not just utilitarian. I mean, there is genuine love expressed across their letters. They revere John Jay. His daughters revere John Jay. So how does then this explain their can you make the connection? I mean, it's hard to say, because of course the Adams are famously like high expectations and some pretty, David knows far more about this than I do, but when John Adams and Abigail Adams basically say, if you're not president of the United States, then you've given all the resources that we put at your disposal, you're a failure. I mean, what a different
No
parenting
pressure.
strategy. Yeah, different parenting strategy. So yeah, I feel like each generation does feel like they're doing the business of when they're alive and when they're dead, to keep the memory alive, to keep the love alive. William Jay's wife, Augusta, worships John Jay. Does say to her son, you have a great name of a great person, and you should be really proud and happy and use that. And so the idea that there's a legacy, not necessarily about slavery, although that's where you see it most, is definitely part of their upbringing. That the sort of loyalty and love between generations and responsibility for your siblings and your elderly parents is in the sort of fabric of their psychology, absolutely. But whether we can say that was the key, I don't know. But that's the kind of material that often doesn't get in the book. But like just the anger, well, since my older brother asked the question, here I will tell a little story. William Jay, so he's living in the house, he's inheriting the papers. Peter Augustus Jay is a very prominent lawyer, trustee of like every major organization in New York City. So it's William Jay who's going to write the biography of the father, which is a lot of responsibility. And the sort of letters as he's writing the biography, and after he writes the biography, of what Peter Augustus, his older brother by 11 years, thinks of it, and expressing his anxiety, as any author knows, that anxiety that you did good, you pulled the task off, is very human, right? That he does want reassurance from his older brother that he's been good enough for the task of keeping the memory of the father who they both revere alive. It's just, very human moments like that I encountered throughout my research.
We're at a couple minutes before we have to end it, so I'm going to just take one last question from Myra Zucker-Brown, who says, Jay was related to a large number of powerful people who held and it's cut off. I'm not quite sure which she may intended to say there. Slaves, perhaps. She then adds, does the book make clear how many of the family were people of wealth and power?
I mean, the Jays are related by blood and marriage to practically every elite New York family over time. And they continue to marry into other elite families, sometimes extending up to the New England elite, so that John J. Chapman, carries the name not only of the Jays, but of Marie and Weston Chapman, one of William Lloyd Garrison's most important lieutenants, a major female abolitionist. These families get entwined over time, all over the place. And, and every one of those families, the Van Cortlands, the Livingstons, they all own slaves, traded in slaves. Their primary wealth in New York is in land, right? And the ways in which land define wealth and stayed in families, even as these families grew, there's still plenty of New York land to keep the dividends rolling in. But yes, they are enmeshed in all of the New York families and all of that entails. But most of them don't do what the Jays did, which was define their subsequent reputation by their commitment to this singularly important cause.
Well, I personally wish that we had we could beggar your time so we can get to the rest of Professor Wallstreicher's excellent questions. But we are at 8 o'clock. So I'm just going to say again, congratulations on what is really a fantastic book. I hope that everyone enjoyed tonight's conversation. If you want to read a little bit more, the Gotham Center recently published a blog piece by Professor Gellman, but I hope you will all follow the link and go out and purchase a copy of the book for yourselves, because it's definitely worth the read. Congratulations. Thank you so much for an excellent conversation. And Professor Wallstreicher, thank you so much for your excellent questions. I want to thank you all for watching, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening.